Thank you everybody for coming along today to our webinar, What's the Deal with Dingoes? On behalf of the Victorian National Parks Association, I'd like to acknowledge the many First people of the area now known as Victoria and honour their continuing connection to country. This place is a very special place and we're very lucky to live here. And we offer our respects to elders past, present. My name's Jordan Crook. I'm a Parks and Nature campaigner at the VMPA. The VMPA, a short history for those who are just learning about the VMPA, has been around over 70 years. We advocate for evidence-based policy to safeguard wildlife, habitat, and protected areas such as national parks. We inspire connection to nature through citizen science activities, community action, advocacy, and education. We're independent, not-for-profit, non-government, and membership-based charity. We're an incorporated association with members open to all like-minded folk. So tonight's an interesting one and a semi-new one to the VMPA with dingoes. There's always been a policy at the VMPA, and with Dr. Cairns' work and the unprotection order coming up, we decided we'd throw our hat into the ring and back locals and traditional owners who are calling for better protection of this vital apex predator. But just before we start, we'll do some quick housekeeping notes. The session is a webinar, which means you can see us and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. There's a little button down the bottom that you can put questions in, which is Q&A section. So feel free to put questions in there. We'll get to a few of them at the end of the event. And the ones we don't get to, we will endeavour to try and get them answered to you. So we've got technically three speakers on tonight. We should go for 45 minutes to an hour, and we've got some VIP there as well. So unfortunately, Kylie Blake, proud Wadawurrung woman and Biodiversity Project Officer at the Wadawurrung Traditional Owner Corp, wasn't able to make it tonight in person, but we did a pre-record with Kelly last night, and we'll send that around to folks who've signed up, and it'll be inserted into the video that goes onto YouTube later. It'll be like she was always here. So we've talked to Kelly and she's all good with that. Our other speaker is Dr. Kylie Cairns and Mel Browning, the director of the Australian Dingo Foundation. So our first speaker is Dr. Kylie Cairns. Kylie is a conservation geneticist based at the University of New South Wales. She's passionate about conserving and understanding Australian native species. Much of her work to date has been on dingoes, studying their evolutionary history, genetic identity, and modern patterns of hybridization. Kelly, like most of us here at the VMPA, enjoys bushwalking and camping and is driven by a desire to protect our wildlife and national parks for future generations. So I'll hand over to you now, Kelly, to do your presentation.
Excellent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's the deal with dingoes, using DNA to answer questions about the identity of Victorian dingoes. So first off, what are dingoes? This is a family tree based on DNA, which essentially compares dingoes, domesticated dogs, village dogs, and wolves together. And what this tree is showing is that dingoes are distinct from modern domesticated dogs, but they might share some ancient ancestry with Asian dogs. The closest relative of dingoes is the New Guinea singing dog, which is basically a wild dingo that's found in the highlands of New Guinea. Also, they're also quite closely related to wolves, particularly the Asian wolves. But it's a little more complicated than that. And scientists are still figuring out their evolution of dogs and dingoes and their relationship to different wolf populations. In fact, new research that's been published in the last few years suggests that there may have been different and multiple wolf ancestors that resulted in multiple lineages of dog, with the dingo being an example of the Asian dog lineage. And almost all modern domesticated dogs are a mixture of Eastern and Western dogs. And molecular dating has been done on dingoes, and that work suggests that dingoes and New Guinea singing dogs have been distinct from other dogs for up to 11,000 years. Despite the fact that the ancestor of dingoes came from outside of Australia, they are considered to be native. So they are listed as native wildlife in Australia, but in most states they are unprotected, even in national parks. And I think a lot of people find that very surprising. The Australian legislation defines species as being native if they've been present in Australia since or before 1400 AD. So given dingoes have been present in Australia for at least 5,000 years, but perhaps up to 10,000 years, they certainly fit that definition of being native. Another definition that scientists might use when they're talking about nativeness is an evolutionary definition. And effectively what that's about is whether other wildlife recognize and respond to the presence of dingoes. And they do. And that effectively indicates that they are adapted to the presence of dingoes and dingoes are adapted to them. And dingoes are a really important part of healthy ecosystems. So conserving dingoes does not just benefit dingoes, it also helps maintain a diverse and healthy ecosystem. And they do that by controlling large herbivore populations like kangaroos, and that flows on to effectively more vegetation and more diverse types of vegetation, and it can even affect soil health. And this action provides a net benefit for native wildlife, particularly small and medium species. And when dingoes are intensively controlled in the landscape or locally extinct, like in places like central Victoria, this can favour invasive species like foxes and cats, or goats, pigs and deer. So they do play a really important part of healthy ecosystems, and we do need them in our environment. So are dingoes distinct from domesticated dogs? This is a question that scientists have been looking at for a number of decades. And this is a figure that depicts the genetic relationships between wolves, domesticated dogs, dingoes, and the New Guinea singing dog. Each coloured dot is a different sample. And I've put some rough red circles or ovals around them to sort of group them with the labels so that you can see what we're talking about, because the legend is simply too small. And what it shows is that dingoes, which are down here in the bottom, are distinct from both wolves and domesticated dogs, and also that dingoes and New Guinea singing dogs are clustered together. That confirms their close relationship. And this figure is actually from a study that was published a couple of months ago. And a key finding of this work was their use of ancient samples. So I think they had something like 10 ancient dingo samples, and they sequenced the whole genomes of those animals, and they found that effectively the ancient and the modern dingoes cluster together, which suggests that modern dingoes do not appear to have significantly changed from their ancestors in the last few thousand years. And genetic research that I've carried out over the last decade has identified that there is significant geographic variation in dingoes, and there are at least 2 varieties of dingo found in Australia, shown on this map. So each dot is a sample, and the colour is based on their different genetic type. So we found a northwestern type that's found mostly in northern, western and central Australia, and then an eastern type that's largely found in southern and eastern Australia. And these varieties are different genetically, but they also have slightly different skull shapes. And they may have differences in terms of ecology and other morphological features. Molecular dating has indicated that these different varieties of dingo split from each other thousands of years ago. And the ancient DNA study that I just talked about also found this geographic structure in dingoes that were over 2,000 years old. So this indicates that the variation that we see in dingoes today is prehistoric rather than being as a result of hybridization or recent things like the dingo fence. So hybridization has been of concern to people in Australia when we're talking about dingo conservation and management for a very long time, pretty much since Europeans came to Australia. And since the 1990s, scientists have been doing genetic studies of dingoes to look at hybridization levels. So this is a map that shows the estimated dingo versus domesticated dog ancestry in over 5,000 samples across Australia using a type of technology that was developed in 1999. And what studies like this showed is that there were moderate to high levels of dingo cross dog hybridization, particularly in southern and eastern Australia. However, an important part of this research was that there was no evidence of domesticated dogs that had established wild populations in Australia, and only 0.6% of the 5,039 tested dingoes were feral dogs. So that's 31 feral dogs out of over 5,000 animals tested across Australia. However, this research was really concerning because it suggested that less than 10% of the wild dingoes in Victoria were pure dingoes, or that most of the dingoes in Victoria had some amount of domesticated dog ancestry. However, as I talked about before, we now have found evidence of geographic variation in dingoes, and the pattern that we see is very similar to the pattern of hybridization. And so when I finished my PhD and I started wanting to look for new research projects, I wanted to look at whether or not this geographic variation we see in dingoes is impacting on our hybridization estimates. And one of the reasons why DNA testing methods might have had issues is that the method of DNA testing that we've been using, both government and private people or researchers, it was first developed in 1999, and it effectively uses 23 bits of DNA or 23 DNA markers across the genome. However, today this method would be considered quite limited because of the small number of genetic markers and the type of technology that it relies upon. Indeed, now we can look at thousands or hundreds of thousands of DNA markers across the genome of an animal for the same cost and less effort. So I really wanted to apply this new type of technology to DNA testing of dingoes to bring dingo research in line with global standards for identifying hybridization in wild animals. And in fact, the method that I've now worked on is similar to the methods that were used to look at hybridization in wolves or European wildcats or bison overseas. And just as an example of why the number of DNA markers can have an impact on the result, just as a thought experiment, say you had a 1,000-piece puzzle and you had to guess what the animal in that puzzle is from 23 pieces. You probably wouldn't have a very accurate idea of what that picture is. But if you had 500 pieces of that 1,000-piece puzzle, you're more likely to have an accurate picture of what that animal is. So that's just an explanation of why more markers can be a more accurate and reliable way of DNA testing animals. So what we found when we applied this updated type of DNA testing, where we had over 195,000 DNA markers, is that we can see really strong genetic separation from dingoes and domesticated dogs. So in this figure, again, it's each dot is a sample, with the dingoes shown in red, the dingoes that have some amount of dog ancestry showed in orange, The known first-generation hybrids are shown in green, and the domestic dogs are shown in shades of blue. And the distance separating the dots is relative to genetic distance. So basically what we're seeing here is that dingoes are strongly or quite distant from domesticated dogs. And the analysis shows us that the genetic distance between domesticated dogs and dingoes can be used to inform whether or not we're detecting domesticated dog ancestry. And as part of this new study that we published last year, we were actually able to compare the results of both the old and the new types of DNA testing for a set of 100 dingoes. So we tested those 100 animals using both the new and the old method, so 195,000 DNA markers and 23 markers. And then we basically created this figure, which basically looks at the amount of dog ancestry detected in each sample across different populations. And what we found is that the old method of DNA testing that scientists and governments have been using, based on these 23 DNA markers, it significantly overestimates the amount of dog ancestry in dingoes. In many cases, this overestimation might be as much as 20 to 40% from the new type of DNA testing. And this essentially means that wildlife managers and captive breeding organizations, but as well as government, can no longer rely on this old DNA testing method that we've been using for assessing the status of dingoes. And we really need to carry out updated DNA testing surveys. And here's a map where I've plotted all of the samples that I've DNA tested from my recent study. I think we had about 300 wild dingoes as well as another 100 captive dingoes. And this map just shows their result, the amount of dingo ancestry detected in them, and then their position around Australia. And what it shows is that the occurrence of dog ancestry is much less than what we thought from the previous DNA testing studies. And it's predominantly found, dog ancestry is predominantly found in the east coast of Australia, north of Sydney. And really what I wanted to highlight from this is that we see very little evidence of feral dogs or first generation dingo cross dog hybrids around Australia, which tells us that there's some sort of barrier or trait that seems to be restricting the interbreeding between dingoes and domesticated dogs. And when we look specifically in Victoria, the amount of dog ancestry is significant, is very different. The amount of dog ancestry detected in wild dingoes is very different from what previous studies had found. So previous studies had suggested that there were as few as 10% of the animals were dingoes, whereas my study found that 87% of the animals we tested were dingoes with no evidence of domesticated dog ancestry. And the lowest amount of dingo ancestry that we saw in a wild animal was 80%. So really what this work is showing is that the dingoes in the wild in Victoria, they are dingoes, and very few of them had any evidence of domesticated dog ancestry. And this work is being corroborated by another study which has been accepted, and I hope to see that published soon, and it will be very interesting for everyone to see it. And I'm also testing more samples from around Australia, and these results are consistent. So another thing that people often bring up when they're talking about dingoes is coat colour. So people used to think that colours like sable or piebald, so this white with patches of colour, or brindle were evidence of dog ancestry in dingoes. And updated research has actually indicated that dingoes can be all of these colours, plus black and tan, black and white, ginger and white. And we see this from both museum specimens, but also DNA testing of wild animals that have really variable coat colours. And in fact, when we look at the wild dingoes that we tested from Victoria and the surrounding regions, we see a wide variety of coat colours, and this is in animals that have little to no evidence of dog ancestry. So the take-home message from this is that wild dingoes can have a wide range of coat colours, and that coat colour should not be used to identify or infer domestic dog ancestry. Another of the key findings of the research that we published last year is that there are at least 4 different wild dingo populations. So this is a figure first that shows the clustering of the wild dingo samples and the captive dingo samples, showing that there are different populations coloured differently, and then a map that shows the distribution of those different populations around Australia. So we have 4 different wild dingo populations around Australia, and then also captive dingoes form their own population from wild dingoes, and that's partly because of the way that captive dingoes have been bred, and the fact that they're very genetically diverse, because they basically are a mixture of some of the different dingo varieties in the wild. And this result is really exciting, but it's also concerning, because 3 of these dingo varieties exist south of the dingo fence, where there is persistent and ongoing lethal control. And in fact, in Victoria, you're very lucky, because you actually have 2 different dingo populations present, one that's in the eastern part of Victoria and the other one that's found in the northwestern part of Victoria. We don't know exactly why these different dingo populations are different, but we do think that some of this variation might be ancestral, so potentially from different immigrations or types of dingoes arriving in Australia. But there's almost certainly also some adaptation of dingoes to the local conditions where they're now found. Another key thing that we found from genetic research in the last few years is that dingoes have really high levels of inbreeding and lower levels of genetic diversity than domesticated dogs. So this is a figure where dingoes are shown in red, and the x-axis is the number of basically inbred segments or bits of genome that are the same in individuals. And along here we have highly inbred dog breeds, moderately inbred dog breeds, low inbred dog breeds, village dogs, and wolves. And what this is basically showing is that dingoes are extremely inbred compared to domesticated dogs and wolves. And this might be the result of evolutionary history, so the way that dingoes came to Australia and then spread around Australia and have evolved into the ecosystem, but it may also be due to ongoing management practices. And so really we need more study to look at this problem and assess how much of a conservation concern it is for dingoes. In fact, the research that I published last year showed that dingoes in the northwest of Victoria have extremely high levels of inbreeding. That would be basically above the level of sibling breeding, and that dingoes in eastern Victoria, as well as other parts of Australia, are also have high levels of inbreeding. That's quite concerning. So just a summary of the updated DNA research that I've talked about today. Previous DNA testing is biased, particularly for southern and eastern dingoes, and government really needs to carry out new genetic surveys around Australia. I just want to highlight that the Victorian government has actually done this, and I think that research will be published soon. Also, concern about dingo and dog hybridization is not warranted. In fact, we see little evidence of dog ancestry across most of Australia. And places where hybridization might be an issue, that's really a local or more regional problem. Our testing found that in Victoria, both across eastern and northwestern dingoes, they carry little evidence of domesticated dog ancestry, and they have a wide variety of coat colours. Also, coat colour is not a useful tool for assessing the ancestry of dingoes, and dingoes might be or are impacted by inbreeding and decreased genetic diversity, which is a really serious conservation concern, and we need more research on this matter. And then before I finish, I just want to talk a little tiny bit about dingoes and their species status. So there's ongoing debate about the scientific name of dingoes, whether they're their own species or a domesticated dog or a subspecies of wolf. I just want to highlight that in Victoria, dingoes have the name Canis lupus dingo, i.e. they're a subspecies of wolf. That's what the government policy is at this point in time. And scientists have been debating this for a number of years now, and I don't think that it's going to be settled anytime soon. But some food for thought about some of the research that I've just talked about and what implications that might have for the taxonomy or the species status of dingoes. So I found that dingo and dog hybridization is uncommon, and that suggests there's some sort of reproductive barrier between dingoes and dogs. It could be behavioral, but still there seems to be something that's impacting their reproduction together. And that's often one of the features that scientists look at when they are deciding if a population is a distinct species or not. Also, we know from studies of feral dogs, both in Australia and overseas, that they have poor survival in the wild and they do not breed successfully in the wild generally. Again, that shows that there's some sort of fitness difference between dingoes and dogs. Also, dingoes are genetically distinct from domesticated dogs, as I've shown in multiple figures before, and they've been distinct for 10,000 years approximately. And at current, they're on a different or a divergent evolutionary trajectory that is discrete from domesticated dogs. Basically, dogs are really good at being our companions and dingoes are really good at living in the Australian bush. And the last thing that I want to say is that distinguishing wild canids like dingoes from domesticated dogs is really important. Even if they can interbreed, all wild canids or canis species can interbreed. So that means wolves, coyotes, jackals, dingoes, and dogs. And that shouldn't be the feature that we hang our hats on when we're talking about species status. And that's the end of my talk. So I just want to thank all of the various researchers and people who've been involved in this research around Australia and who've contributed samples, because without those samples, we wouldn't be able to have any of this research happening. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kylie, for all that overwhelming amount of information, very dense and amazing work. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to move on to Mel now. So Mel Browning is a director of the Australian Dingo Foundation. The foundation is a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to advocating for dingo conservation, public education, and facilitating non-invasive research across a broad range of disciplines. Try and say that quickly 5 times in a row. The charity supports over 40 pure and entire dingoes at its Dingo Sanctuary and Research Centre, located on 40 acres in the foothills of the Macedon Ranges in Victoria. And I was very lucky to join Mel and Lynn there, be about a year ago now. So amazing place. So folks should definitely get out there and meet Mel and Lynn and the dingoes and get to know these amazing species. So Mel has a science background and has always had a keen interest in conservation. She's been actively campaigning for dingo protection for almost a decade as a spokesperson for the foundation. And Mel has been a speaker and attendee in many forums, as well as speaking and advocating on TV and radio and working with state and federal MPs to look after dingo. So Mel holds a Victorian dingo licence, and we met one before. She lives with her 2 dingoes, Minka and Lawali. I hope I said that right.
You did.
So, yeah. Awesome. So over to you, Mel.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. So I'm going to start off with just giving you a bit of a background of the new legislation. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
I don't know if I shared it with sound, that's all.
We'll find out.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So Dingoes are afforded no federal protection, and we believe they are the most vilified, misrepresented, and persecuted of all Australian native species. They are legislated as pests or wild dogs in most jurisdictions across Australia and are killed under the guise of wild dog control due to their perceived threat to livestock. Incredulously, in Victoria, they are both listed as a vulnerable threatened species, but also their status as unprotected pests or wild dogs on vast tracts of public land within 3-kilometre buffer zones around private land, as well as on private land, has just been renewed yesterday, with a new dingo unprotection order in council taking effect. So if we have a look at what was released yesterday, the new dingo unprotection order runs from yesterday until the 1st of January 2028. And the map currently shows roughly where dingoes are locally extinct. So you have a look at the yellow arrow down the bottom here. Across most of Victoria, they're locally extinct. We have this little population of big desert dingoes up here, which are now fully protected, the Wilka dingoes of the Wadawurrung nations. And the shaded areas are where the unprotection order is in place. And that amounts to about 1.4 million hectares of land in this shaded region, which forms the unprotection order on the public land estate, which includes national parks. And then there's another about 1.7 million of private land where they're deemed pests and unprotected. So in these zones, dingoes are proactively killed on over 3 million hectares, essentially, in their remaining range. Within these areas, dingoes are subject to extensive 1080 poison in ground and aerial baiting operations, as well as trapping and shooting. I must add that there was a bounty on their head that has now been removed under this current, the new renewal of the order. So back on the 14th of March this year, as I said, the big desert Wilka dingoes of the Wadawurrung nations were protected on private and public land. And this is due to them being critically endangered, genetically distinct, as Kylie identified with her cluster diagrams. And there's an estimated as few as 40 breeding adults left. Now, back in March, there were $550,000 set aside to help livestock producers in that area transition to non-lethal protection. And they can apply for an authority to control wildlife if they are having ongoing issues with the dingoes. As of yesterday, the government have announced an additional $2 million for non-lethal dingo management in that area to support farmers to adopt non-lethal dingo management strategies. So in the east and northeast or eastern Victoria, they will now be spared that $120 scalp that was being paid to recreational hunters on their scalps. They will continue to be unprotected and legislated on private land as agricultural pests, and any person on private land can trap or shoot a dingo or bait a dingo within the 3-kilometre buffer zones surrounding private land. That includes national parks. Dingoes will remain unprotected and will be proactively killed in these areas by 18 government-funded wild dog controllers and other authorised persons as the department sees fit. Active trapping and shooting will continue, as will extensive ground and aerial baiting operations. Now that's covering the legislation. Now I'll move on to our little presentation about dingoes. So I've called this presentation Champions of Biodiversity, and this is a phrase coined by a wonderful researcher called Professor Mike Letnick. So I've stolen that from him. So basically, the Australian Dingo Foundation was founded by Lynn Watson and her late husband, Peter Watson. And as Jordan said, it is a not-for-profit organisation. We run entirely on volunteers and donations and sponsorships. We do educational tours, but they are strictly by appointment. So if you want to come and see us, you really need to ring up and make an appointment. And we receive no government funding. So we rely on a tireless team of people to come and exercise and enrich the dingoes. And we do have a wonderful dog food sponsor, which is Taste of the Wild. Better give them a mention, but that's pretty much us. The Dingo Foundation is definitely a science-based organisation. Our founder and director, Lynn Watson, is not only a world-leading cynologist or canid specialist with decades of hands-on experience with dingoes, but she has also mentored and collaborated with many leading Australian and international scientists, as well as co-authored and contributed to over 25 peer-reviewed research papers. So what is a dingo? So this is a little bit of fun. There's a bit of an urban myth amongst dingo advocates that their opera house shaped ears could have been the true inspiration behind the design of the opera house. It's just a little fun thing for you. But seriously, how can you tell the difference between a dingo and a dog? Dingoes are genetically, as Kylie said, distinct, developmentally, cognitively, behaviourally, biochemically, and physically distinct from domestic dogs. So over thousands of years, nature has perfectly crafted these apex predators to adapt to vastly different ecosystems across Australia, from tropical dingoes in the northwest to desert dingoes in central Australia and alpine dingoes on the eastern seaboard, as well as the unique population of big desert dingoes we've talked about in northwest Victoria. So the tropical dingoes of the northwest up in the Kimberley are like little monkeys that can scale sheer rocky escarpments in search of prey. Alpine dingoes that we find here in Australia on the eastern side are quite fox-like, with thick double coats and bushy tails, and patiently wait to ambush their prey in forested areas. Desert dingoes are sinewy with long muscular legs to run down prey in the arid centre. So dingoes may look like cats. Sorry, I've said that so many times. Dingoes may look like dogs, but they act like cats, incredibly agile, wary, aloof, and independent, with the intelligence to rival some primates and as flexible as snake on legs. And here's a naughty dingo getting over a fence. Every physical adaptation of the dingo has a purpose for its survival in the wild. They have broad heads and narrow shoulders, and a dingo will place its back feet in the footprints made by its front feet. This way of walking is known as direct registering, which is an effortless stealth way of walking to move silently through the landscape. So some of the hallmarks: dingo's head is the widest part. They have pricked, hooded and highly mobile ears, a furrow down the middle of their forehead, and almond eyes positioned at a 45-degree angle for maximum vision. Their heads appear large compared to their long, narrow body. Notice how the chest doesn't reach their elbows. This allows dingoes to have the unique ability to cross their elbows. Dingoes do not have sebaceous glands all over their body like dogs, and hence they do not have a doggy body odour. They have a narrow-fronted, long tubular rib cage that provides extra protection for their internal organs against attacks from kangaroos, and a fully haired stomach, unlike domestic dogs. So dingoes are supremely flexible and supple and so much more than a dog. They have the ability to rotate their joints, allowing them to turn their heads laterally 200 degrees. If a dingo loses its footing, its brain floods with dopamine. It goes ragdoll and flops to the ground, unlike a dog that's brain is flooded with adrenaline and goes rigid and hence is at greater risk of injury. Dingoes are tool users. Their combined agility, intelligence, and problem-solving ability has resulted in many dingoes learning to open fridges, cupboards, doors, and windows, with one report of a captive dingo learning to open a ring pull of on the tin of sardines. Ernest, you might be watching. Dingoes' incredible problem-solving skills and independent thinking are beyond any other canid species in the world. They're a species we want to be proud of. They're very special. So dingoes are loving. They pair for life. They grieve deeply and have been known to lay down to die next to a deceased mate. Dingoes have a single mating season, which is the hallmark of most wild animals. Unlike domestic dogs that mate twice a year, dingoes usually live in family groups that typically include one breeding pair and their young of various ages, with group size ranging from 3 to 12 individuals. It takes a father dingo and an extended family to successfully teach, protect, and care for pups. Family groups maintain a distinct territory within a home range, and top orders, like dingoes, self-regulate their numbers through complex social and territorial behaviours, and lethal control upsets that natural balance. So, just like lions and tigers in Africa and wolves in America, dingoes are our Australian native apex land predator. They are the boss of country and the champions of biodiversity. Australia's native wildlife has survived and thrived for thousands of years under the protection of dingoes, shaped by nature to fulfill the critical role of apex predators, providing ecosystem resilience and stability. Dingoes pick off the old, weak, injured, and diseased, ensuring genetically strong and healthy populations of their native prey species. So, apex predators are the most persecuted species type in the world, as they are the most likely to come in conflict with humans, but their removal can have catastrophic cascading impacts that reverberate through entire ecosystems, resulting in devastating losses of native flora and fauna. This phenomenon is known as a trophic cascade, with research revealing extensive cascading effects of apex predator disappearance in marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems around the world. Pictured here is a diagram from a dingo-induced trophic cascade prepared by Dr. Thomas Newsom of Sydney University. So with dingoes, native prey is preferred. They have a Paleolithic digestive system with a strong preference for lean protein, as they don't produce the enzymes required to digest fatty meat such as lamb. Weighing in at just 13 to 20 kilos, dingoes require only 350 to 500 grams of food per day. As expected, this chart shows that dingoes' diets differ widely from introduced foxes, in that they mostly consume larger native and invasive mammals compared to foxes that tend to eat small native mammals, reptiles, birds, and invertebrates. So in the news this week, there's been a lot of talk about the critically endangered night parrots in the Great Sandy Desert. And to quote an ABC News article that came out this week, Indigenous Desert Alliance ecologist and co-author Rachel Paltridge said cats were avoiding night parrot roosting habitat containing dingoes, which ate the invasive pest. On average, 15% of dingo scats collected from the night parrot sites contained cat remains, and on some trips it was up to 25%, she said. So the survival of night parrots that are critically endangered is really to do with stable dingo populations in the area, keeping cats down. The ecosystem services of dingoes is not yet fully understood. For example, a peer-reviewed research paper published in 2022 found that dingoes provide critical ecosystem services through the long-distance secondary dispersal of vital fungal spores that colonise plant roots in a symbiotic manner and extend far into the soil. Their major role is to enhance nutrient and water uptake by the host plant. So with all the benefits dingoes provide in the landscape, you have to ask yourself the question, is broad-scale lethal control humane, effective and or justifiable? This traumatised dingo is dragging a leg hold trap. His bonded partner is close by howling in distress. This graph, so why are dingoes so heavily targeted? When you look at this graph, and it shows relative livestock losses of different predator types. And we believe this is indicative of Victoria, but this survey was done in New South Wales and ACT. And dingoes are well down in terms of the type of predator predating on livestock. So foxes, domestic dogs, roaming domestic dogs, and crows pose a far greater risk than dingoes on livestock. And historically, over the past 20 years, predation trends have followed the trends of the overall Victorian total sheep flock. Livestock losses to dingoes in Victoria during this time frame have been minuscule and have never amounted to more than a predation rate of 0.016%, or, in other words, 160 livestock losses per million head of sheep, and yet millions of dollars are spent on lethal control. To bring that up to date, these are figures from last year, 2023. If you divide the number of livestock killed and maimed just last year, which was reported by the Agricultural Department as 1,372, by the total Victorian sheep flock, which is 14.6 million, then you find that the predation rate of dingoes killing or maiming livestock is currently a minuscule 0.009%. Compare this to up to 30% or 15 million lamb deaths each year across Australia caused by exposure, with other more prevalent causes of lamb losses than predation being starvation, mismothering, and dystocia. And yet the widely reported damage caused by dingo predation is 13 to 18 million annually. Now, you don't have to be Einstein, and yes, that's the name of this little dingo here, to figure out that this figure has no relevance to actual livestock losses, but it relates to opportunity costs and the costs of wild dog control. I just want to give people a bit of an overview of some of the information that the Agricultural Department have been putting out. And as Kylie said, they've commissioned their own DNA research, and it's not yet published, but at some of these drop-in centres and on the webinar, we got to see some of the outcomes of this study. So just a bit of an overview. They tested 298 samples from wild dog control operations across Victoria. They found that dingoes are genetically distinct from domestic dogs, as per Kylie's research, with zero shared ancestry with domestic dogs found in the Big Desert region, and less than 4% shared ancestry in the Eastern Victorian population. So we've got dingoes. Basically, what's living in the wild are dingoes. Dingo abundance in the Big Desert is estimated at around 110 individuals, with potentially as few as 40 remaining. Dingo abundance in Eastern Victoria is estimated at around 4,900, with potentially as few as 2,640 remaining. Dingo trapping data from government-funded wild dog control activities shows a marked decline over the past 18 years, with 468 trapped and shot just last year, plus unknown numbers killed as a result of poison baiting. It begs the question that with no baseline data available and the potential population in Eastern Victoria being as low as 2,640, are dingoes already experiencing a dangerous decline that will only be exacerbated with this renewal of the dingo unprotection order? Now, what you're looking at here, these pink zones are areas where wild dog aerial baiting is happening, and it's been carried out for 10 years, over the past 10 years, every 6 months. In their last operation in May this year, there were 425 kilometres of transects baited and a total of 3,730 baits deployed. That just shows you, that's just aerial baiting, not ground baiting, the extent of the baiting of dingoes. And yet, research by the Arthur Rylah Institute back in 2018 was carried out in a state forest approximately 15 kilometres southwest of Swiss Creek in East Gippsland. It demonstrated that 1080 aerial baiting tips the predator balance in favour of feral cats. So we're knocking out a beneficial native predator in the dingo, and we're getting explosions in feral cats. So the trajectory of aerial baiting after aerial baiting is all bad for our native wildlife, all good for cats and all bad for our native wildlife. The question also must be raised is if precautionary principles are being applied in extensive fox baiting operations in protected areas for dingoes to ensure that our vulnerable dingo populations are protected and are not negatively impacted. The Southern Arc program alone deploys over 16,000 fox baits each year. Now, Peter Fleming from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry states, you cannot separate dingo and fox control because the methods that you use, particularly baiting, take out both species. So extensive fox baiting is undertaken across nearly all national parks in Victoria. Our own research at the Australian Dingo Foundation has determined that dingoes find the fox baits palatable, they'll dig them up, they'll eat them, and that 2 milligrams of 1080 poison is enough to kill a dingo with an LD 50, like lethal dose 50, knocking out half of the dingo population with a confidence interval of 95%. Hence, we have real concerns about fox baiting. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to play.
I remember shooting 30 foxes in one night when I was a kid, going from water to water in a dry season.
I'm not sure if these slides are going to play. You can hear? Okay, I'll go back. Hang on. So, my introduction. David Pollock claims that returning dingoes to the landscape has resulted in major positive benefits to productivity, landscape health, and biodiversity. So we'll hear from David.
I remember shooting 30 foxes in one night when I was a kid, going from water to water in a dry season. And I haven't seen a fox track for 5 years. At the end of the day, you have to be able to manage the grazing pressure on your country, and without dingoes, we just can't do it here.
I'm hoping everyone heard that.
Yeah, it didn't go that great. Yeah, it
didn't
sounded
go
a bit weird.
Let's see if we can get Angus. So Angus Emmett ceased killing dingoes in 2001, resulting in major positive benefits to productivity. He's a cattle producer, or was, landscape health and biodiversity. Let's see if we can hear Angus.
Talk about feral management, feral animal control, feral animal management. I do. The dingoes being left alone keep feral dogs away. They keep the roo numbers right down low, and they keep cats and foxes down to very low numbers. So it cost me no time and no money to come up with outcomes that's far above most of my surrounding neighbours who spend lots of time and money to try and achieve the same result.
Yeah. Okay. So we believe that coexistence between wildlife and livestock is the way to go. And we recommend that people do an internet search and find the Predator Smart Farming Guide by the Humane Society. It's a wonderful publication. Kylie touched on successful on-farm non-lethal protection. We'd love to see the government investing in a lot of this stuff and doing a lot of trials, which they will be in the northwest, but also it'd be great if they were doing it in the east. The one thing I want to say here is, like, if you look down the list of non-lethal protection opportunities, dingo urine. So our founder, Lynn Watson, was involved in a peer-reviewed research project that came out this year that found prime age male dingo urine can deter other dingoes for several months. What would be great is some funding for that to produce a synthetic version. Farmers could spray it around their posts of their lambing paddocks and keep dingoes away rather than throwing baits around. So, that's a pretty exciting project that could be in the pipeline with some good funding. So that's pretty much it from me. Our position on dingoes is that we want to see them fully protected on all public lands across Australia. So thank you everyone for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Mel, for your passion and work as well as the awesome presentation. So thank you, and thank you to Lynn as well. Hopefully she's watching.
Thank you. Nura Nyari Kellyanne, Wadawurrung Bingi Baguruk. My name is Kellyanne and I'm a Wadawurrung woman. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from Jara country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, also their ancestors and their future leaders, and also to the Murup, the spirit of their country, in which protects me and looks after me here. So great respect there. Thank you so much for asking me to join in. I apologise, I can only join in via, a pre-recorded session. I'm just totally flat out right now, and I'm trying to balance work and life and kids and everything else. But thanks for having me so much.
It's awesome. It's awesome to have you here and to share your experience with dingo and connection to dingo. As conservationists, we look through scientific lenses and the like, and ecosystem niches and the like, but traditional owners have such a long, strong connection with dingo. So it's really great to explore that and show the conservation world as well as the rest of the community that connection. So your connection as a traditional owner with dingoes obviously goes back tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so my connection with dingo personally is that, well, I live with one. So I'll just take it from a personal perspective that he is considered my family. He's my kin, my son. And often I get confused when I'm talking about them both. I'll say, for example, oh, can someone go let Will out of the enclosure, bring him inside? And they're like, Will? I meant Jack. So I automatically, subconsciously, have this in my mind that they're both my sons. So that's pretty funny. But I guess traditionally our connection to dingo has been, like you said, for millennia. And I recently did some research that showed us, using desktop research, that catalogued a lot of historical information, articles and things like that to talk about the cultural connection with dingoes, rather than just looking at them from an ecological lens, as we know them as an apex predator and how they balance country, etc. I was trying to deep dive into what has been written about dingo in the past and also in the present, and what are the cultural significance of dingo to mob, particularly in southeastern Australia. Now, I do want to note that everything that was written wasn't written by us. It was never written by us. And that's where I feel some of the research lets us down, because, again, it's being told through a Western lens, a colonial lens, and therefore you can take parts of that information and you can let it sit with you, but really you need to kind of balance it out a bit too and go, well, is that true? Is that, you can, as mob, we can only feel what is right and what is true about our connection with dingo. So when I say connection to dingo right now, the physical connection is quite limited because of what's happening in Victoria, but our spiritual connection, our song lines, our stories, the memory of dingo and dingo in our hearts and our cultural connection to country, that still remains strong and present, and that is never gone, and it will never die. That's what I have to say about that.
That's awesome, and the passion is amazing, and they're an animal that are easy to become passionate about. Like they're very charismatic, but they're not dogs. They're like our dogs, but they're not dogs. And for you and your mob, that connection, like it's hard to comprehend that. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. So your work at the Wadawurrung Traditional Owner Corporation is as a biodiversity project officer. Yeah, in that work, how you bringing dingo into that work and helping bring that balance back to country.
So that's I started off in the biodiversity. I started off as a field officer at work, and I guess my research at uni led me to learning more about dingo. And again, I'll just add that it wasn't just because I all of a sudden decided I wanted to research about dingoes. This happened in a more spiritual way for me. It felt as if dingo chose me, not I chose dingo, because to be honest with you, and people should close their ears, I was a cat person for a long time. And so my sort of journey began when I was doing an essay for uni, and then everything like sort of had a flow-on effect where it just became apparent that I needed something inside me, as well as everything that I was listening to with country, because country is the teacher. And what was coming through to me was saying, you must look at dingo more, research dingo, look at dingo, bring back, reawaken the knowledge that is sleeping about dingo for your mob, but also for everybody. So this wasn't just about for mob, this is for everyone, and so what I've done in my space is gone ahead and shared the research that I spoke of earlier, which was looking at different cultural themes connected to dingo. So I looked at rock art and association with dingoes in southeastern Victoria. I looked at adornments, so dingoes used in adornments, astronomy, dingo in the sky, dingo also within dance and ceremony. And so ceremony is very, very special. So I don't usually like to use the word dance because it's more than just a dance, but also the dualism of treatment. So the common treatment that us people, our First Nations people, our mob was subjected to alongside dingo. They're culturally iconic and most spiritual. It's a spirit animal, and to see that animal being wiped out and killed, it was like you were being killed, your family was being killed. So it was like also a bit of a how would you say, I don't know, an extra stab or spear, it hurt. So I talked about my research. We got mobbed together. We had really nice yarns on country. We talked about what do we want to see for dingo. We mightn't be able to have dingo sort of restored back onto country in my lifetime, but our future generations could potentially. And how can we start with little bit? What can we do now that can restore our physical connection with dingo? And so we talked about maybe doing what Barangigadjan has done, having some, one of our properties and making it accessible for dingo to be there, and community to come and take some roles in connecting and looking after dingo. even if it's just a couple, you know, just something small. But also, what can we do in the background if we can't physically have Dingo with us? What can we doing? What can we be pushing for? We've made statements to the Europe Justice Commission. We have made and put forward a case study for the 1975 Wildlife Act review, the review of the Wildlife Act of 1975. We put forward a case study for that. We went ahead and we made our own Dingo declaration submission as well. And we joined our neighbours and other mob together at a Dingo statewide conference where we all came together and shared with each other the significance of Dingo. Now, for us, our word for Dingo is Dawal, meaning wild Dingo, and Gal, or Gal, or meaning companion Dingo or camp Dingo. And so at that conference, I'll just say we had mob go there and we were so delighted, and it felt so good and so strong and strengthening for us all to get together for the particular reawakening of Dingo importance, and that we all stood together side by side, you know, for the protection and conservation of Dingo. Yeah.
That's awesome. And really like super inspiring work, and rebuilding that connection with the dingo is so important. And as conservationists, ally conservationists, for me, it's really important to uplift your voice in these conversations, but also empower you and have your back when decisions like today's were made. So it's yeah, I'm tearing up a little bit, but today's decision was a horrible one by the state government on an animal welfare grounds and conservation grounds. But for you, that goes a lot deeper. And say what you like, but don't feel like you need to say much.
So I'll just set the scene for you. Today was such a beautiful day on Jarrah country, and Jack and I, so Dingo Jack and I, we were walking and we went for a very big walk, and there were times that he would look back at me and I just saw a smile, like, because they actually smile. They smile when they're happy. They smile when they're happy. They can talk to you through their eyes, and I feel what he feels. And today was a happy day before. You know, today was a happy day when we were walking, yeah? And then later on this evening, I found out the news, and out of respect, I've put some wattle in the background because, you know, today it feels like a little bit of a day of mourning for me. Feels like this evening is a bit of a morning feeling, I think, because I feel we made some good progress. The day I got the text that said the unprotection order had been lifted and all of that was a day of celebration. We got calls from everyone and we're like, oh, look what's happening, look what's happening. And we were like, yes, finally we're being heard. Finally, people are seeing what we see, and maybe, you know, they probably can never feel what we feel, but I mean, our allies do. And so when we got that message today, everything sunk. It just was like, really, were you ever really listening, or was that just to keep us quiet for a little bit longer until you found another way that better suited the agriculture, you know? Or is this the cop out? Is this a cop out we have to, you know, accept, because no one can get their minds around the fact that just because dingo is not physically in certain areas of Victoria, that does not mean that their significance, their importance, their as a spirit animal to us people, us mob, you know, but also a friend to our allies, shouldn't be protected. their memory, the energy of country, the song lines, the physical component is, they're not there, but everything else about them is, and it's no disconnect. It's the same thing as if they were there. So the protection of dingoes on country should be on country, whether they're there or not, because it's protecting the cultural significance of dingoes, so that one day we could bring them back to where they should be. So thank you for listening, and I won't apologize for being upset, because I think we all are upset, and but we'll just let that sit. I'm just going to let that sit and process, and keep loving my boy, and doing whatever I can in the background to keep fighting. So thank you.
No, thank you very much for sharing on this really, really shitty and sad day. So give Jack an extra hug for us. And the VMPA and myself, like we're with you as a conservation group, as an ally to, like, we're not going to stop until dingo are properly protected. So we came a long way, and we're not going to let this bad decision derail that good work that was already on its way. So we're with you, and thank you very much for sharing, and whatever we can do to help, we're here to help. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jordan, for having me, and everybody having me tonight. And even though I couldn't be there, but thank you for allowing me to speak and use my voice, even if it's a pre-recorded. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a few questions from the chat. So I think Kylie's still there. So if Kylie and Mel, turn your cameras back on and your mics back on. Yeah, awesome. So I got a few questions here. What form of biological samples is the DNA testing based on? Does it require capture, or can you use passive methods such as fecal sampling?
So at the moment, my research has predominantly been carried out on saliva samples from captive dingoes. That might be wild-born animals that are now in captivity, or captive-bred animals. Also blood from captive animals, or tissue in the form of ear clips, or whatever type of sample we can take from deceased animals that have been killed as part of wild dog control, or that might have been collected by private citizens from roadkill.
Awesome. Yeah. And then the other question is, there's lots of dates around about when dingoes made it to Australia. Is it still very much hypothesized, or is there any research that's really starting to nail it down when they got here?
So we know from the fossil dating studies that dingoes have certainly been present in Australia for at least 3,500 years. So the oldest fossils are 3,500 years old. There's still needs to be more research looking at identifying more fossils or archaeological remains of dingoes and testing them. But also scientists have done molecular dating, so that's using the DNA to work out how long dingoes split from other dog populations or from the New Guinea singing dog. And from that, we know that dingoes and New Guinea singing dogs split from each other about 8,000 years ago. And at that time point, there was actually a land bridge joining Australia and New Guinea. So it's quite likely that that's when dingoes came to Australia, and that they came over that land bridge instead of coming on a boat with a person.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's quite a few messages really excited about the urine deterrent, Mel. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, I wish Lynn was here. Yeah, look, I think it's pretty exciting. Can we maybe do a link to the research for people to view? But Lynn's probably better to talk about that. But basically, dingoes are fiercely territorial, and that's how they manage their own populations. So if you imagine they're the apex, there's nothing above them. So they've got to, in nature, they manage their own populations. So if you have a family of dingoes and they have their home range and another dingo comes in, he's likely to get killed. But they mark their territories with urine. So it kind of makes sense that if you have a primate male who's in his prime, and there's certain pheromones or chemicals within that urine that other dingoes will detect it. And I think there was a recent study with mice or something using scent as a deterrent, and the particular Kylie might know more. But we'd love to see some funding go towards developing a synthetic version of the pheromones or semiochemicals in that primate urine that you could get a drone and spray around your fence posts in your lambing paddocks. This is all the sort of stuff. There's really been no investment that we've seen from any of the state or federal governments into non-lethal methods. Victorian government did do some work retrofitting. The department did do some work retrofitting fences for people who were impacted by the 2019 and 2020 bushfires in East Gippsland, and that was really successful. They've got YouTube videos on it. So they retrofitted old fences with solar electric, and the dingoes just stay away. So yeah,
That's awesome. Great. All right. Well, thank you both, Dr. Cairns and Mel, for your time and work and advocacy. And I don't know if folks can see, there's a cute little dingo there, but there's a QR code here. If folks want to send a message to the state government, letting them know you're disappointed by yesterday's decision and that there's a better way of going about it. And that's the VMPA's view, is that there's better ways of keeping dingo in the landscape while also protecting stock. And the best way to do that is to bring First Nations cultural knowledge along with academic conservationists and farmers. So there's a better way of doing this. And yesterday was a blip and a big mistake, but the future, if we all work together, is a lot brighter for dingoes. So yeah, please continue to support the VMPA so we can help groups like Mel and get the word out and keep advocating for wildlife such as dingo. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll try and get back to the many questions that are in the Q&A. But thank you everyone for coming, and see you soon.